Dr. Fauci has been a public servant and leader in the global health field for more than 4 decades. He currently serves as the director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, a title he has held since 1984. Dr. Fauci has advised 7 presidents on prominent global health issues. Throughout the last year, Dr. Fauci has become well known for offering scientifically grounded leadership during the COVID-19 pandemic. He currently serves as the chief medical advisor to President Biden. Dr. Fauci has earned many of the most prestigious awards available to a person in his field, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom. We are thankful for all that Dr. Fauci has done in service of our country and to help manage the current pandemic. Today, he is here to talk to First Class Laura Spratling about resilience in the pandemic.
Thank you so much for taking a few minutes out of your busy day to have a conversation with the Naval Academy Foreign Affairs Conference.
Happy to do it. Thanks.
So this year, the theme of our conference is global resilience after the pandemic, and we're so excited to get your perspective as someone who has been a scientific leader in your field for more than 4 decades and as someone who has helped lead the United States through its coronavirus response. To begin, could you talk a little bit about your experience in dealing with emerging infectious diseases and how that has helped prepare you to lead the country through its COVID response?
Yes, one of the things that we don't appreciate it very much until it happens is that new infectious diseases historically have emerged throughout the history of our civilization. They're doing it now and they will always do it. So one of the things related to your question that you have to be aware of is that you have to have lessons learned after each experience. So I've been doing this now for about 37 years as the director of the Infectious Disease Institute, and my first real upfront experience with an emerging infection was HIV back in the 1980s, when it was a mysterious infection. We know very little about it, but over years, it evolved to really understand the extraordinary scope of this outbreak. And then there were other outbreaks. There was pandemic flu, there was Zika, there was Ebola, there was chikungunya, and now there's COVID-19. I would have to say that of all of the outbreaks that I've ever had anything to do with, this is the most extraordinary in the sense that it has immobilized the entire planet now for well over a year. I don't think any aspect of our society, not only domestically, but globally, has not been influenced by this. In the United States, as you probably know, there have been 538,000 deaths, which is historic in its proportion, the worst we've ever seen since the historic pandemic of influenza in 1918. So the lessons you learn are that outbreaks occur, they are unpredictable. You generally don't know all you need to know about it right away. It evolves. Like there were so many things about COVID-19 we did not fully appreciate. At the end of the day, the lessons you learn about mistakes that have been made or miscalculations that have been made, it's very much like war. I mean, my military colleagues, of which I have many in the Department of Defense, say when you go into a war, you have a battle plan. And then when the bombs start going off and the bullets start flying, the plan doesn't mean very much. You have to plan because it really helps you, but you have to ad lib a bit and you have to improvise a bit. It's the same thing with an outbreak. You really need to be prepared, but in addition to preparation, there's response. And that's the thing that hopefully we've learned a lot about over the last now 14 months that we've been involved in this.
So Dr. Fauci, you talked about how unpredictable something like this is, comparing it to war, but I know you actually did predict an influenza-like outbreak like this. So what did surprise you about this pandemic, and how did you come to make such a prediction?
Well, it was my experience with emerging outbreaks that the worst kind that you have to worry about when people ask what my worst nightmare is, there are some outbreaks that are scary in some respects, but deep down they're not going to have a global impact. Like Ebola is a scary disease, but it is not spread very readily. You have to have direct contact with someone who's desperately ill and be in close contact with bodily fluids, blood, feces, urine, things that contain the virus. That's not what goes on with a respiratory infection. It could be really very subtle. 50% of all the infections that get transmitted with COVID-19 are from persons who are without symptoms. That makes it very, very difficult to control a respiratory infection because classically and historically, most respiratory infections are spread by people who are with symptoms, not without symptoms. 50% or more of the COVID-19 infections are spread by someone who doesn't really have any symptoms. So it's a very unusual experience that we're going through right now. As you know, related to your first question, I hope that we have lessons learned about this, and we the next time that happens, we're better prepared, and we also respond more appropriately.
Yeah, you mentioned just how infectious it is, and I know that's been a large problem at the Naval Academy. We have asymptomatic, healthy young people. We have 4,500 of us living under the same roof, so it's definitely been difficult from that perspective to try to control it here. So what has been your experience throughout the decades in trying to persuade people, the public, and also administrations to take public health seriously?
Well, that's a good question, and it varies. It really does, from administration to administration. Generally, when you have an outbreak, by the time it gets bad, everybody understands what they need to do. It's those who understand in the very beginning that this is something that you need to do something about. Early in the course of the HIV pandemic, there was little attention paid by the leaders of the administration. So they could have used the bully pulpit to alert the population that this was a serious issue. But because of the stigma associated with HIV, particularly among a disenfranchised group of people, namely mostly men who have sex with men and some injection drug users, there wasn't enough attention paid to it. And that was something that I think historically the Reagan administration would likely going to be judged by history in a non-favorable way. Then on the other hand, you had somebody like George W. Bush, who helped, not only helped, but essentially sent me to Africa to develop the PEPFAR program. And that saved millions and millions of lives. So there was the example of a president who showed leadership that resulted in saving literally millions of lives throughout the world. And there really is varying. Like right now, as you know, the last administration was, and still is now, we're living in a very divisive society. I mean, anybody who knows anything about looking at what's going on in our country, it's very divisive. That is really not a good formula to address a public health crisis. So hopefully we will more and more pull together as a nation and fight the common enemy, which is the virus, not each other. But it's been really a difficult situation over the last year when wearing a mask or not wearing a mask became a political statement, which was very unfortunate.
And how do you think public health and wearing a mask, like you mentioned, got so politicized in the United States when this didn't necessarily happen in other countries around the world?
Yeah, I think it was just poor timing, if you want to call it that. Is that we had an outbreak at a time when it was an election year, and we had been building up over the last 4 years a considerable amount of strong hostility between the different parties. When I was back in the 1980s, when I was leading the effort against HIV, that was 40 years ago, 37, 38, 39, 40 years ago. There was differences politically. There was different ideologies, but there wasn't the intense hostility associated with the differences of opinion, where right now there's no compromise at all. It's either my way or no way. That is a very bad formula for having the country pulled together to essentially address a common enemy. And I don't know how we got that way, but when we did, it became a very, very difficult situation with which to address a public health issue, because differences in ideology should never, ever influence public health policy and public health decision. But for about a year, which was the whole year of COVID-19, that's what we saw. I mean, it was very clear. If you wore a mask, it was a political statement. If you went to a bar and didn't abide by the public health measures, that was a political statement. There should not have been political statements associated with public health issues.
Now, as politics got all wrapped up in public health, like you said, how did you personally maintain your voice of integrity and your voice of science throughout this response?
Well, I made a decision that I was going to continue to tell the truth, regardless of the pressures that were put upon me. I was not going to be telling people in higher places, from the president down, things that they wanted to hear. Sometimes I had to tell them some inconvenient truths, which created difficulty for me. As you probably know, historically, that I was put at odds with the administration, and that was not a very comfortable situation to be in. But I would rather be in an uncomfortable situation and maintain my integrity than to try and get comfortable and lose any respect for myself. So that's how I did it. You ask how I did it. I did it by making the decision that I was not going to risk integrity and truth just for the sake of being convenient for some people.
I think that's a big lesson for our midshipmen listening and for our foreign delegates who are going to serve in militaries around the world. So thank you for that. How would you, moving on from that sort of conversation, how would you assess the United States' response overall from the beginning to the vaccine rollout? And would you defend any part of it to our international delegates?
Well, I think we did a lot of things correctly early on. There were a lot of missteps. You know, the testing didn't go very well. We opened up too quickly and abruptly after the big surges. We decided that we were going to open up the economy and open up the country. And we laid out, myself and Dr. Birx, we laid out a bunch of guidelines for safely reopening. We had the gateway, the phase 1, the phase 2. You may remember that, how the cities and the states could gradually reopen in a safe way. But that's not what happened. Many of the states decided they were just going to jump right into a complete opening, which did nothing but create a major surge. Same thing this past winter. Instead of doing the things you needed to do around the holiday season, there were a lot of people who did not abide by the public health measures. And we had a massive surge. There was a period of time there a few months ago when there were 300,000 to 400,000 new cases a day and 3,000 to 4,000 deaths per day. That was horrible, completely unacceptable. So those are the things we did wrong. The things we did right was the science. I mean, developing a vaccine, more than one vaccine, a few vaccines in absolutely unprecedented record period of time. The virus sequence was known on January the 10th of 2020. Within 65 days, we were in a phase 1 trial. By the time we got to July 27th, we went to a phase 3 trial. And then 11 months from January, we had a highly efficacious vaccine going into the arms of people, which was completely historically unprecedented. The reason we were able to do that was the extraordinary investment in basic and clinical science that we had made over the previous several years to decades. So I think science was the big success story in this outbreak, which has brought us vaccines that will ultimately end this outbreak. The outbreak will end because we will have vaccinated the overwhelming majority of people.
Um, so I know that the United States was supposed to have an extremely effective response. Like all of the public health indicators said that we were the most prepared possibly in the world. So what did those indicators not account for?
They didn't account for what you and I were discussing about 5 minutes ago. It didn't account for the fact that we had a very, very divisive society and we were pulling against each other instead of together with each other. Instead of the virus being the common enemy, we were fighting with each other. That is the worst formula for responding to an outbreak.
What's the biggest lesson that you think we as a nation can take from that and try to apply it moving forward?
Yeah, moving forward, there are a couple of lessons. One, a global pandemic requires a global response. We have to have a lot of interconnectivity, collaboration, cooperation, and synergy among the different countries of the world. The second thing is that we do really need to realize that when you respond to a public health crisis, everybody's got to be pulling together. One of the issues of our own country, which is the beauty of our country, which the founding fathers made a point of, was to create a federalist system where the states had a considerable degree of independence and discretion in doing things their way. That works really well in some circumstances because we have a very diverse country. It's a gigantic country in size with a lot of people. It's got diversity of climate, diversity of culture, diversity of so many things. So you like to have the states have the prerogative to do things their way. However, when you're dealing with a pandemic, the virus doesn't know the difference between Mississippi and Louisiana, or between Idaho and Montana, or New Jersey and New York. So instead of everybody doing things their own way, the lesson is we've got to do it in a really consistent way, because there are certain fundamental ways that you address a viral pandemic. And it can't be 55 different ways. It's got to be one uniform common denominator how to approach that.
Do you think the world and the international community can take away a similar lesson?
I believe so. I mean, there were some countries who did it right, mostly because of the circumstances within the country. I mean, you have a small country that's an island. It's very easy for them, as opposed to a massive country like ourselves with so many diversities within the country. But some countries did it really quite well. Others were just like us. Many of the European countries went through the same thing we went through and are still to this day going through the same issues that we're going through.
We've talked a lot about lessons learned here. So what's one lesson that you have learned personally during this pandemic?
Oh, personally, it isn't a lesson I learned. I just stood by my guns. And that was always speak the truth based on the data and the evidence as it exists. You have to do that. You can't, when you're in a position of somewhat semi-authority, of being responsible for recommendations and guidelines, the data and the science must drive what you do. Anecdotes don't work. You've got to collect data, and data means the truth. And you stick by it and you don't compromise. So that's a lesson I learned a long time ago. It was just confirmed in me during this experience that we've had with COVID-19.
What would be your message for undergraduates? How should this pandemic affect us, and what does our generation need to do to be more resilient for next time?
Well, normally when people ask me about what undergraduates should do, I always say, I was in your shoes at one time and I understand how you feel. But, it's a little bit different now, because you all at the academy this year have experienced something that no other classes have ever experienced. So nobody can tell you, oh, I know what you're going through, because they really don't. You've had your life completely disrupted. You are in an institution, that has such a history of tradition, of of camaraderie and spirit. So you were able, I believe, as an institution to do well, but you lived through, I mean, I did too, but I'm not a student anymore. If I had my student year impacted the way you all did, I mean, that would be something that I would never forget for as long as I live. So hopefully, when you all graduate from the academy, you will be much stronger and you will have much more resilience than you went in based on the experience that you had to go through this year.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci. I appreciate that. My final question is one that we've been asking every speaker in our conference. So in a few words, what is one good thing, and it can be something small, that will come out of this pandemic that will make the world more resilient?
I think it's going to be an appreciation of the everyday things that you never paid attention to before this pandemic hit. And then when it hit, you appreciate how much you miss it. I mean, like gathering with friends, seeing your family, being able to, congregate in a way where you have that spirit and collegiality. You take that for granted. I'm never going to take that for granted again.
I feel the same way. And I think, as you mentioned, we've definitely felt that here at the Naval Academy. But Dr. Fauci, on behalf of the United States Naval Academy, thank you so much for being with us today. I'm confident that my generation will remember you as a bright light in the midst of this extremely challenging time.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate you having me.